of Robert Mugabe.
Yes, Dan Miani, my colleague and fellow presenter, joining me. Dan, it's always difficult to, excuse me, tackle a story like this, doesn't it?
Yes.
I mean, you want the respect for the family, but also you've got to look at a tainted legacy.
I mean, as a political leader, you're in the public eye, so whatever you do, and some people will like it, and some people won't like it, and Mugabe has this legacy that's both good and bad, and that's the reality of the fact, while, of course, the world at this moment will be paying tribute to his contribution to the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe and in Southern Africa. Let us not forget the contribution of Zimbabwe to our own liberation struggle here in South Africa against apartheid. People will also be remembering that later on in the years, after a lot of hope and optimism that Zimbabwe's independence brought in 1980 to this part of the world, there was a lot of mistakes that were made. As we speak, there are millions of Zimbabweans who are spread across the world, including in South Africa. The economy is in dire straits. Human rights violations have been highlighted year in and year out. Despite Emmerson Mnangagwa's presidency since last year, Amnesty International issued a report just 2 weeks ago when the government, the police, they banned a march by the MDC, both in Bulawayo and Harare, to say that human rights violations in Zimbabwe are horrendous. So you've got this mixed bag of a legacy. But we must not forget that when Zimbabwe became independent in 1980, it brought a lot of hope that finally the end of colonialism from the north of Africa to the southern tip of Africa was nearing its end. So he brought a lot of hope.
I mean, he was rather reluctant getting involved in the peace negotiations, wasn't he? But he was smart enough to realize that this was the way to go.
Samora Machel played a key role. People don't know this. I was based in Mozambique, working for Radio Mozambique's English service at the time of the Lancaster House conference, where Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister in Britain, surprised people by bringing all these parties together. Mugabe was not keen to go. Under President Samora Machel's guidance and advice, he ended up leading a delegation to London for the Lancaster House conference that involved all other parties, the late Joshua Ngoma, Abel Muzorewa, and others. And, of course, at the time, the man who was running Rhodesia, then Zimbabwe, Ian Smith. So he reluctantly had to go in, because there was a realization at the time by Mozambique Samora Machel that the war against Zimbabwe, the liberation war, had reached a particular peak, and Mozambique was one of the first countries at the time to impose sanctions against Rhodesia, then, now Zimbabwe, and close down the pipeline that was transporting oil from Beira port city to Mutare. So Mozambique was suffering as a consequence, and the attacks in rural Mozambique, central Mozambique, particularly the provinces of Manica and Sofala, were getting worse and worse. With the Ian Smith regime at the time, with the support of the then South African apartheid government, pounding railway lines in Mozambique, schools and clinics, and forcing lots of people to run away. So Samora said, it's not going to end like this. We have an opportunity for dialogue. Let's find reconciliation. In fact, it was the first time I heard the word reconciliation being used in the political lexicon of the time.
And reconciliation, I mean, there was so much hope in the beginning when Robert Mugabe took over, and then what we've seen in so many countries, you know, the corrupting power steps in, often hiding behind the colonial attacks as an excuse to continue their abuses.
I think there's a complex picture that we have seen emerging for many African liberation movements once they go into power. You're quite right. They get into power, they have a particular liberation mandate that they want to implement. And the reality of power is that it does corrupt once you are in power. And President Mugabe overstayed his welcome in power in Harare. His own people then turned against him. We saw how they celebrated last year when he was ousted and President Emmerson Mnangagwa took over, although they are yet really to enjoy the fruits of that change. So at a particular time, I don't actually know when and how, but at a particular point in his history, I think Mugabe believed somehow that maybe he was there destined to really, as an invincible leader, to run this country until he dies, which he almost achieved, because just a year ago he was ousted in power, and now he's gone. So there were lots of policies that became wrong. The ZANU-PF government at the time, when it took over, it focused on certain things that were important. Education, they maintained that. Everybody will tell you about the high standards of education in Zimbabwe. But he also tried some new land policies, which over time failed because of how they were being implemented. The intention may have been right to implement a radical land reform, but the way it was done and implemented actually destroyed the agricultural sector. Zimbabwe was a wonderful exporter of tobacco and other products. In fact, I recall Samora Machel at a rally in the then Salisbury, which is Harare today, went in there as a first leader. He said, Zimbabwe is going to become the breadbasket of Southern Africa.
Let's leave it there.